Hello, everybody. Happy Sunday. Hope all is well. You know what came back in the mail this past week? That's right. History by Mail has returned for the month of Smarch. And what in the world? All right, well, there's our write-up. Let's see what the document is. Oh, March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. August 28th, 1963. There's the program for... Oh... Look at that, like, parking diagram? I'm guessing this is going to be the, yep, this is the schedule of events for the March on Washington. Where is he at here? Oh, there you go, number 16, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What's on the other? Oh, holy cow. Oh my. Okay, so this is the, I'm guessing this is the pamphlet. Or I guess that was handed out. Let's see. Signed. Okay, so there's the petition. There's the demands. We demand, yep. Desegregation of all school districts in 1963. I mean, that's a pretty succinct list. And, you know, it's something that should not have had to have been demanded. What is the asterisk by demand? Support of the march does not necessarily indicate endorsement of every demand listed. Interesting. Some organizations have not had an opportunity to take on an official position on all of the demands advocated here. Well, that's an interesting thing. This is a really interesting one. There's a lot going on. I'm going to put that up in the background. Actually, that'll be a distraction mainly for me. We'll put the less written side up. But here we go. Okay, so here we are. This is what we have. Let us get into it. I'm probably going to have to take a break midway through and get a drink, but let's get into it and see what we got. This is the original program, okay, for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28th, 1963. Enclosed is the official program for the march, the largest event of the civil rights movement. The march took place at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Wednesday, August 28th, 1963, and is perhaps best known for being the site of Martin Luther King's I added the junior, so I threw myself off, famous I Have a Dream speech where he called for an end to racism. Hard to believe that in 1963, it really seems like we haven't gone, or since 1963, we really haven't gone anywhere. Background for the march. After the Civil War and into the 1960s, Jim Crow laws legally established racial discrimination throughout the American South. In early 1941, several prominent civil rights activists failed to effectively lobby the Roosevelt administration to end discriminatory practices in defense jobs and New Deal programs. In response, veteran civil rights activist and union leader A. Philip Randolph proposed an organized March on Washington. Their efforts, became known as the March on Washington Movement, MOWM, and also included efforts to desegregate the military. Randolph and Bayard Rustin, another veteran activist with experience in coordinating mass protest, estimated that they could attract over 100,000 participants. Just days before the 1941 march was scheduled, FDR issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination in federal vocational and training programs and defense companies with contracts with federal agencies. With pressure from the FDR administration, especially after his demands were met, Randolph agreed to cancel the march. Interesting. All right. Randolph and Rustin continued to promote the idea of mass marches on Washington. They organized the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom at the Lincoln Memorial on May 17, 1957. Actually not familiar with that one. To commemorate the third anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. The march, which attracted approximately 25,000 people, featured prominent civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Executive Director Roy Wilkins, and African-American U.S. Congressman from Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell, with the Queen of Gospel, Mahalia Jackson, performing. That's a heck of an event. In late 1962, Randolph proposed the idea for another march to the leaders of several major civil rights organizations. The official aim was to improve the economic welfare of African Americans. Unofficially, however, Randolph was also searching for a way to unify the major national civil rights organizations which often acted independently due to their separate agendas and competition for resources and media coverage. The year 1963 was selected for the march, marking 100 years since Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. All right, here we go. Now we've got the lead up. Randolph and Rustin set up headquarters in Harlem, New York, and Washington, D.C., with only 2 months to plan. Wow, really? Rustin and a staff of volunteers coordinated the details of the march. To advertise, they set up press conferences, delivered speeches, and mailed thousands of flyers to churches, youth and civic groups, unions, and a variety of other organizations. Thousands of people soon wrote back expressing their interest in the march. Importantly, Rustin was also able to involve the Big Six, head of the National Civil Rights Organizations, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League, James Farmer of the Conference of Racial Equality, and John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Randolph himself. That is a power dais right there. And I'm sorry, I keep moving this around even though it's not really out of frame here, but I've got all this stuff on the phone, and I'm reading through there. Several events in 1963 created momentum leading up to the march. SCLC co-founders Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Shuttlesworth launched Project C for Confrontation, a massive nonviolent protest against the Jim Crow laws in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. That's, if you took a history class regarding America in the 60s, I guarantee you read that. While in prison for the protest in April, laying out his case against segregation. In April and May, daily sit-ins and mass protest marches were held in Birmingham. The protests were met with police brutality, including fire hoses, attack dogs, tear gas, and mass arrests. Over 3,000 people, including children. Press images of the police brutality shocked the nation. There was, that bridge in Birmingham. I cannot recall the name of it. It may mention it here. On June 11th, after having met with prominent civil rights leaders, JFK, that would be Kennedy, announced on national TV and radio that he would begin to push for civil rights legislation. Later that night, NAACP Field Secretary for Mississippi, Medgar Evers, yes, there's a name that we should know in the civil rights movement, was murdered in his own driveway by a white supremacist. The outrage over the murder of this prominent civil rights activist sparked protests and further created momentum for the march. On June 22nd, 2 months before the march, JFK Vice President LBJ, that's Lyndon Johnson, and Attorney General RFK, that would be Bobby Kennedy, met with the organizers, concerned that the march would lead to violence and that it was ill-timed. Martin Luther King responded, "Frankly, I have never engaged in any direct action movement which did not seem ill-timed." JFK tasked his brother, Attorney General RFK, he was one of the only people the mafia actually feared. More on Robert Kennedy at some point in the future. With coordinating security for the event, and the march organizers agreed to end the march at the Lincoln Memorial rather than the Capitol, so members of Congress would not feel threatened by the large crowd. Here we go. Events of the day. The march began at the Washington Monument with a rally featuring celebrities. Participants then marched along the National Mall to the Lincoln Memorial, where the speakers on the enclosed program up there spoke. At the end of the event, march leaders met with JFK at the White House. MLK agreed to be the final speaker, as thousands of people were expected to leave after hearing him speak. MLK's speech, which was scheduled to be 4 minutes long, actually lasted 16 minutes and became one of the most famous speeches in history. And if you haven't heard it, there's audio of it pretty much everywhere. It's powerful, not just the words, but how the emotion and the emphasis he put into them. Where in the world was I? Ah, yes. The speech became known as the I Have a Dream speech, despite the fact that those words did not appear in his originally prepared remarks. Mahalia Jackson stood behind King and said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream," referring to a theme from his earlier speeches. MLK then spoke extemporaneously of his dreams about the end of racism, ending with the dramatic words, and when this happens, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Just take a moment and think on that for a second. The response to the march. The March on Washington gathered international attention. Approximately 250,000 people attended, and roughly three-quarters were African American. The march itself was peaceful, though protesters were attacked in several southern cities. Well, sadly, that came with that territory. In Washington, the march created an alliance of civil rights, labor, religious, and other organizations that came together in an act of unity. The unity was rare, as civil rights organizations often disagreed on tactics, even leading up to the march itself. Some wanted to completely shut down Washington, D.C. through civil disobedience, while others wanted the movement to have a nationwide focus, not just Washington. Despite attending the march, Malcolm X echoed the sentiments of more radical civil rights groups who said the march had little effect and referred to it as the farce on Washington. After the march, violence continued in Birmingham. In September, a bomb killed 4 African-American girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Millions of Americans were outraged by the violence of the police and the KKK. The momentum created by the acts of violence, protests, media displays, and the March on Washington created a climate for change. In the subsequent 2 years, 2 landmark pieces of legislation provided significant advancement for the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and ended segregation in schools. Employment, and public facilities. Then, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The third of the 4 documents in the Civil Rights series. There's a website if you would like to check it. And I honestly did not know about the 2 marches prior to the one in 1963. I was unaware of those, but this is just another. And I think the thing that I like, you can't really tell. Obviously, all of these are reproductions, but they put them on much different paper. Like this, the print up is printed on, I think, just like your standard paper, but this is a little thicker cardstock. It just adds a little more feel to it, and I just really like that. Just what a tumultuous time in U.S. history, and really, honestly, looking at it, sometimes it seems like we're further away than we were, 61 years ago. But the thing is, we just have to, there were people that did it back in the 40s, back in the 50s, back in the 60s, all throughout today, and people are still going to do it. And one day, to echo, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one day, we all have that dream when all of this nonsense will be a literal thing of the past, and we can essentially move on together as a species. But this, however, is always fun. Just good old history by mail. I've said it before, I'll say it again. History is not pretty, but it is necessary. So, thank you so much for joining. Hopefully you enjoyed it, because I always enjoy some history by mail. And what a great way to kick off the week or / end the weekend, depending on when you're watching this. And we will see you next time.